Whenever I get to John's gospel in the lectionary text, I want to sing that song from Sesame Street. One of these things is not like the other. One of these things is different somehow. Because, John, you know that song from Sesame Street? Because John's gospel is so different than the other three, than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's different in the stories that it has different characters, it's different in symbolism, it's different in the way that Jesus relates to his disciples. There's not the parables or the short, pithy sayings in John that are in the other gospels. In the Gospel of John, Jesus speaks in long monologues, and this particular section that is the end, the Constance read, is the end of one of those long monologues, 3 chapters long, known, scholars call it the farewell discourse, like Constance alluded to that. It's Jesus' long commentary to his disciples and then a prayer. What's happened right before this is what we know as the Last Supper and the story of Jesus washing the feet of the disciples. And what happens right after this is Judas betrays Jesus to the Roman guards, and he goes to Pilate, and he's arrested, and he's crucified. So this is really the last thing that Jesus is saying to his disciples, and this part of it is a prayer. And this prayer is essentially a prayer for unity. I don't know if you caught it, but essentially in those 6 verses, Jesus prays 3 times, may they all be one. Essentially the same thing over and over again. Father, make them all one as you and I are one. Maybe they be one like you and I are one. May they be completely, perfectly one. There's this prayer for unity. Of all the things, Jesus is about to die. There's lots of things he could be praying for. The other Gospels have him pray, Lord, take this cup from me, but not my will, but yours be done. But in this Gospel, Jesus is praying for unity, for oneness. Not super surprising to think about the context, if we think about the context of John's gospel. This gospel was written last of the ones we have in our Bible, about 60 or 70 years or so after Jesus died. And scholars think it was written by a particular early Christian community that was suffering a lot of pain from separating from the Jewish community that they had been known by and part of for a long time. Because of their conviction that Jesus was the Messiah and the Son of God, they were getting brought up on charges and essentially excommunicated from the synagogue. And for any of us, and I know there's some in this room, who've experienced being kicked out of a faith community because of your identity, your sexual identity, your gender identity, because of your beliefs, because of what you look like, that pain is unbelievably hard. And so that was causing divisions even among themselves as a Christian community. And so it's not surprising that as this community was writing this gospel, writing this memory of Jesus, that they would draw on the traditions of Jesus that talk about unity. It's not surprising that they would latch on to this message of Jesus about oneness. But for me, maybe it's just me, when I think about oneness or I hear someone talk about oneness, there's a part of me, or the call to unity, there's a part of me that gets a little bit cynical, especially if that call to unity comes from someone who's like me, who embodies a lot of what has power and privilege in the world. Because sometimes a call to unity can be a call for the status quo, right? Go along to get along, like just be nice, don't rock the boat, a way to kind of support institutionalized power. But that's not the kind of unity that Jesus is talking about here, right? The oneness that Jesus means, oneness isn't the same as sameness. We can just look at Jesus to know that that's not true. Of all the things we know about Jesus, one of the things we know is he drew to him a motley crew of diverse folks, poor and wealthy, men and women and children. Even some Pharisees were in the mix with Jesus. There's stories of him going and dining at Pharisees' houses. There was a diverse group that followed with him and were his friends. He didn't ask them to all become the same. They were diverse at the beginning, they were diverse at the end. And if we kind of move back and look at the Bible as a whole, we see that diversity isn't something that we're supposed to get over, but is the very nature of God's design and plan. The creation stories are filled with stories of diversity. the different creatures and humans living in harmony. The story of Noah's Ark that we just talked about a few weeks ago, this God desired to preserve the diversity of creation, 2 by 2, all the animals into the ark. Even the Tower of Babel, which sometimes it's that story of the people all spoke the same language at that point, and they were building a tower, and God decided to give them different languages so they couldn't understand each other. Sometimes that's seen as diversity as punishment. But I think a different way, and I would say a more faithful way of looking at that story, is that it brings us back to the way that God creates us to be as this living in diversity together. Even the Bible itself, the way it's constructed, it's contradictory, it's full of different stories, different theologies. So what we're left with is the sense that the difference, diversity, is the very nature of what God intends for us, the place in which we find God. So for Jesus, unity, oneness, isn't the same as, isn't sameness. But the prayer that he prays for oneness can seem as a miraculous, to me sometimes, as miraculous a desire as Jesus walking on water. Because we know that we can say we want oneness in the midst of diversity, and yet that is so hard. We can see that in our own world. Right now, the politics of difference are ripping the very fabric of who we are as a country and in the world. We see that, right? That difference, rather than seeing as something that is a vision of God, a vision of creation, it's seen as something that we should be afraid of. Be afraid of the Muslim. Be afraid of the immigrant. Be afraid of the transgender person. Be afraid of the homeless person. Defend, protect, become we, homogenous we. Difference is meant to be afraid. And so how is it? This prayer of Jesus, right? It seems like, how is that possible for us to live into this unity, this wholeness that Jesus is praying for his disciples, when diversity, difference can so often be a tool to divide and to cause pain? Well, as is often the case, I think Jesus knows something that we do not, or at least maybe we can see it through a glass darkly, but hard for us to kind of fully live into. Because I think the oneness that Jesus is talking about, the unity that he is praying for, is not a goal for us to be achieved, not something that we need to do or produce. It's a quality of who God is. It is the reality in which we live in. Unity, oneness is not something for us to achieve. It is the water in which we swim, the air in which we breathe. The Christian mystics are our friends here. They talk about that God, in the Gospel of John, actually, I think one beautiful way to understand the Gospel of John is as a mystical gospel. It's hard. The medium of preaching is hard because I want to talk about a mystical experience in a like a didactic method. But the Gospel of John talks about God not as a separate entity, far off in some heaven, but God as a life to be lived, a love to be experienced, that in which we live and move and have our being, the air in which we breathe. That's the gospel. That's what Jesus is praying for, that we would know that unity. But it can still seem so challenging because, as we know, even if we believe that to be true, even if we know that to be true at some level, that we are all created, we make choices as if what's true is separateness. And when we live out of that, we cause pain for ourselves and each other and the planet. It's like that story of the fish, right, who knows that it needs water. It's swimming in the ocean. It's like, water, I need water, where's the water? And it's crashing around into other fish and into the reef and hurting other fish in itself. And it's living in the sea of water. And what it needs to do is just be still and experience the water. That's what we do, right? Or at least I can do that. I can see separateness when really what there is unity. So even though I don't think there's anything that we can do to create the unity that Jesus is praying for here, we do have a responsibility. Cynthia Bourgeault, beautiful Christian mystic, she talks about it as essentially that we're consenting to that presence of God within us. That she says our responsibility is to develop a permanent and conscious connection to the wellspring of oneness, hope, mercy, love that is God in us, around us, within us all the time. A permanent connection with that. How do we do that? I think that's a lifetime of spiritual practice, really. But I think there's a couple things I want to talk about today, and both of them have to do with seeing. We're talking about seeing this month and different ways of seeing, and one of them is making some choices about seeing God. I think it's about choosing to see God all the time and developing a practice that helps us to do that. I'm looking at some of you in this room, and I know you have that. A daily meditation practice, daily prayer practice, getting outside, 5 minutes of breathing in, breathing out. I don't care what it is. Something that puts us in touch with the greater whole that holds us. Something that aligns us with that energy that connects us all. The second thing, is making some choices about how we see each other. To choose to really see each other. And now I think that's kind of a challenging, scary thing to do. Because when we choose to truly see each other, we have to see who that person really is, not our projection onto them. That's pretty normal. We kind of let that go, but who they really are. And sometimes that's scary because what comes up is how different they are than us. And that can feel threatening. I can compare myself with them, which, compare, despair. Have you all heard that? Like, the minute we're in comparison, that makes us feel bad. But it can be scary. But I think what we're invited to do is choose differently. That when we are really seeing someone and we begin to feel afraid, or we're watching someone and they do it differently than us, and it feels like there's going to be conflict and we want to withdraw, that we maybe do the opposite. We lean in. We get curious. We choose curiosity rather than fear. What does that difference revealing to me about that person? What is that difference revealing to me about myself? What is that difference revealing to me about God? Like, we choose to see the people. Maybe we start with our family or the people we live with. And then maybe the people in this room. To really see each other as reflections of divine body that we all live in. Thank God we have each other. Because all I see when I look in the mirror is my beautiful reflection of God's presence. But I need all of you to see the full beauty of God's presence. So Jesus was at the end of his life. And he, I think, knew that soon he was going to get arrested and probably be killed. And he knows he's about to leave his disciples, and they're going to have to continue the work without him physically there present. And so what does he offer them? A reminder, a prayer, to be one, as God and Jesus are one. We all know this to be true, right? We either do this together or we don't do it at all. Laura preached about that so beautifully a couple weeks ago when she was talking about climate change. But we know it's the same thing for any other challenge that we face. Racism, mass incarceration, homophobia, homelessness. We do it together or we don't do it at all. And the it that we do is live in the heart of God. The good news is that nothing can separate us from the love of God. Nothing. There's nothing that we can do or nothing that we need to do. We live in the fullness of God. May we choose and act accordingly. Thanks be to God. Amen.